Hi, everybody. We are back for segment 3 of a 5-part series around Mental Health Awareness Month. With me is Gary Patako Robles. I'm Nina Bosky. Hi, Gary.
Hi, Nina. Great to be
Yes.
back with you.
And he is a mental health professional, but he's also the biographer of Icon, Lifetimes and Films of Marilyn Monroe, volumes 1 and 2. This is volume 1, and look at how thick it is. Volume 2 is just as thick. So if you really want to know about Marilyn Monroe, he's just about everybody's go-to person. Gary, did this really happen, right? And you have such a love and a respect for Marilyn, which is one of the reasons why I wanted to do this series with you. And for the first 2 segments, we kind of set up what this week was really about. And segment 2 was, I think you and I talked about this after we stopped the recording, really how difficult that segment was to really look at the challenges that Marilyn Monroe, most people don't even know. And talking about her all these years, being in the context of how we laid it out was not easy to hear as well. And so I think for the viewer that may have watched the last segment, it may bring up a lot, and that's okay, in the sense that if it's something that you're dealing with yourself, we want to encourage you to get help. And this is what this segment is about as well, is to look for the signs, look in your own life about, are you ready to come forward if there is something that is traumatizing, as whether or not it was as severe as what Marilyn went through, just in your own life, and looking at that, or you have a loved one that you may be concerned or worried about. So with that said, Gary, what are some of the areas that people that you think, in terms of, even with Marilyn, right, at the time, in terms of getting help, she certainly got help, but it's obviously not necessarily the right help, but they might not have known that at the time.
Yeah, we're going back 60, 70 years ago, and the state of mental health at that time was very much prehistoric, I would say. I mean, we were operating from Freudian concepts of psychology, and even the way folks were diagnosed, it was based upon Freudian research. And, you know, since then, real empirical evidence and brain research has come into play. And so we know so much more. We have interventions, we have medications like mood stabilizers that actually work. In Marilyn's day, the treatment was not evidence-based. The treatment didn't teach people coping skills, didn't teach people distress tolerance. In many ways, my perspective is that it almost kept people stuck like mastodons in tar pits, because there was this sense of having to always go back and revisit the childhood and keep talking about the childhood. And if one's childhood is marked by complex trauma, that person, by revisiting, is just re-traumatizing themselves. So at some point, the treatment needs to focus on specific skills in coping and healing, and I don't think we were as good back then in developing concrete skills.
And then you look at her acting method, right? Method acting, the actor's studio. What did they do? They actually had you go back and revisit and be able to conjure up these memories to help you get more prepared for the scene. So that, even in of itself, could have been very triggering for her.
There's really a lot to unpack there, because part of, you know, Marilyn's greatness is in what she was able to achieve at the actor's studio once she developed the method technique. And so certainly her performances became, they had depth and texture, even more so after that period of time. However, there was a specific process in the method where actors weren't to be so staged in their emoting, like in the classical perspective. So acting was much more realistic. So to be realistic, actors were instructed to go back and do sense memory activities. So if a part called for a certain emotional response, they were to go back into their own histories to find a time. Usually it's a negative time, because if you're dealing with drama, it's dramatic situations and serious feelings associated with those. And so she would, you would go back in time to think of this so that you would really feel the emotional reaction, so that your performance was so authentic. So if you have a history unmarked by trauma, it might not be so damaging to go back to look at some parts of your life that were not necessarily the happiest. But in Marilyn's case, marked by so many devastating, complex trauma experiences, Marilyn's now going back using these techniques and getting re-traumatized, triggering herself, probably even dissociating. There's a lot of talk about how she shuts down on the set, and it's hard for her to relate to her directors. And so if the technique involves going back to experiences where males have abused and traumatized you, and you're doing that on a set with a male director, you can see how all those things get tangled together, and she kind of dissociates from the here and now and goes back into the past.
And can you explain for me what dissociation is? I know what it is, but a lot of people, as transformational people in the mental health professional world specifically, know what that is. But for somebody that might be watching that, what does that mean that Marilyn might have been doing, that disassociate?
So yeah, there's this concept of post-traumatic stress syndrome. So if you've experienced trauma, it continues to impact your life. When you're triggered by any event or environmental cue that would unleash a memory from the past. So think of it this way: not all of our traumatic experiences are recorded through the visual memory. So you think about a baby who's maybe in an abusive situation in the dark at night in a crib, and there's nothing visible in the memory of that, but there's a lot of sense memory. There's maybe loud voices and screaming and yelling and fighting that's going on. Think of like a baby living through a domestic violence situation. And so the brain records all of that information. So darkness, certain sounds, certain scents, certain smells, even the blanket against one's body, that baby can grow into an older child or an adult who then becomes fearful of the dark, or fearful of loud noises, or anything that sounds like arguing, or whenever a blanket brushes up against, or whenever there's a smell in the room that's remindful of the smell that was present during the trauma. So all that gets mixed together, and people might not even understand that they're being triggered and they're dissociating. I can tell you a personal experience with a positive dissociation that might help. I hadn't been back to my childhood home in maybe 30 some years, and I went back to the neighborhood, and it symbolized a lot of positive memories. So as I saw certain things, like what the window looked like, or certain cracks in the sidewalk that I used to fly my bicycle over, it started to unleash all of these childhood memories that I hadn't thought about in like 37 years. And they were all positive and wonderful, but they were overwhelming because they were flooding me all at the same time. And I found myself going back in time and becoming very oriented. And my spouse who was with me said I kind of regressed back to a 10-year-old boy and started to hop around. And so I was kind of triggered and dissociated, but in a very positive way. But you can imagine if my childhood had been marked by traumatic experiences, and I walked into this situation and now was overwhelmed by these memories and these feelings, you kind of feel like, you're going crazy, but you're not. It's the function of the dissociation. Some people, when they're in a horrible situation that's traumatic, they might actually zone out of their bodies. They might focus on maybe a doorknob or a fan that's above on the ceiling, and they might feel themselves leave their body and go into the doorknob or go into the fan as a way to just survive the experience, especially if your body is being really hurt or you're really frightened. And it's kind of a survival technique that biology has given us. So to not feel those horrible pains or sensations in the body, we can dissociate. The problem is, though, if your body is doing that to get you through the trauma, when the trauma ends, whenever the trauma is re-triggered, your body starts to behave the same way. So you can be dissociating when you're at work, where you're driving in a car and not even understand what's going on. And it could be very dangerous in that situation to be dissociated.
So I want to share with people that part of the reason why we're bringing this up is to give you awarenesses, because I'm a firm believer, and I know you are too, Gary, on this one, is that once you become aware, then you can decide what you want to do with something. But if you're disassociating, or you're not even aware of what may be happening, that keeps the pattern happening over and over and over and over and over and over and over again. So this is really important for everybody that's watching this today. Is you might not have a trauma as severely as Marilyn, but you may get triggered. And whatever this trigger is in your own life, we want you to be able to look at it and just start to maybe just say hello to it and not disassociate. Because I think that's what happens. A lot of times people don't even know they're disassociating from themselves.
Exactly. Yeah. And you have to be in a space to begin to look at these things, because if you don't have an ability, we call it grounding. There's techniques to be able to ground oneself, to avoid a dissociation, to stay in the here and now when one is feeling triggered. It's very specific skills, but they're really quite simple. And when you practice them, you get better at them. And so you really can't begin to explore some of these really triggering experiences unless you have a means to ground yourself. So you have to kind of learn that as the foundation to get you through processing the trigger, or processing the trauma from the past. And so folks need to be very aware that those skills are necessary, and that therapists will guide you in developing them first, so that it becomes safer to explore in more depth these serious matters.
So in this series this week, or these segments, these 3 segments that we're laying out for everybody in this series, is we've been talking about sexual and physical trauma and abuse. And Marilyn, obviously, she gets married. She now becomes a young adult, and she starts creating the Marilyn Monroe persona. What starts to happen as a result of her trauma? Is she getting help? How is it being displayed in the world from your
Well, in her childhood, she got absolutely no help, unfortunately. So it really isn't until she's working at the actor studio that Lee Strasberg, her coach, recommends to her, if she's going to be engaging in these sense memory techniques, that she needs to enter into Freudian psychoanalysis in Manhattan. And at the time, this was the state of art. And folks who were involved in the entertainment industry and folks who were wealthy engaged in Freudian psychotherapy, which usually went on multiple days a week for many, many years.
I know. I'm thinking to myself, now today's kind of, maybe you might, if you're severe, go twice a week. But a lot of people go once a week, once a month, whatever it is. But when you think about, I can't imagine somebody, unless you're in a facility of some kind or treatment center, that you would be working on this and going to a therapist every single day.
And you had to have a lot of money to be able to afford this.
Yeah.
This was a luxury. And so, now, people need something a little bit, less time consuming. So there's brief interventions, there's solution focused therapy. There's not always the need to go back into the past and process the past, as much as developing the skills to move forward. So we have a totally different conceptualization of treatment now, and we have a lot of research on what works. But back in 1955, Marilyn was seeing a woman by the name of Margaret Hohenberg, who was a psychiatrist who saw her for these sessions. It's kind of interesting to note that she was engaged in psychotherapy with a female provider, and given the fact that Marilyn had a mom who was mentally ill and not able to take proper care of her, there were many maternal issues that were triggered. And so she was drawn to people like Natasha Lytess, who was an early acting coach and kind of surrogate motherly figure, and Paula Strasberg, who Lee Strasberg's wife whom he sent with Marilyn on the sets of her films. She provided the coaching, but she provided lots of emotional support and became a surrogate mother to Marilyn until her death. And Marilyn had many other older mother figures in the course of her life who kind of substituted for the mother she really never had.
Yeah.
And then she left Margaret Hohenberg. Margaret Hohenberg was also the provider for her business partner, Milton Green. So when that partnership ended with Marilyn Monroe Productions, Marilyn switched to Dr. Marion Criss, who continued her work. And Mary and Chris had a lot of experience. Both of these providers had a lot of experience working with children, and they were serving Marilyn. Marilyn then, when she was working in Los Angeles and Dr. Mary and Chris was in New York, where Marilyn's primary residence was, she would need someone to consult with her in Los Angeles. So Dr. Chris encouraged her to see Ralph Greenson, who was on the West Coast. So Greenson started to treat her on film sets very late in her life, and then became her primary psychotherapist when she lived more often on the West Coast in the last year of her life. And he now brought to the therapeutic relationship the trigger of the father. And we know that Marilyn's father was never acknowledged her, abandoned her mother before she was born, and was never involved in her life.
So, Gary, there's a lot of trauma and anxiety in, post traumatic stress syndrome that could happen. What are some of the signs that happen with Marilyn, but for people that might be experiencing it and not even realizing that they are? How did Marilyn act out this kind of post-traumatic stress? But also, let's turn it towards today and somebody that may be watching this, how to look for the signs.
Well, she got stuck in patterns of unhealthy relationships, for one thing. Joe DiMaggio, where we learned was domestically violent towards her. She was involved in some other unhealthy relationships. So that kind of a pattern is kind of recapitulating some of these past issues. And there's also just the intense stress. Like there's kind of this activation syndrome in the senses of the body, where she's, always keyed up and anxious and unable to sleep and unable to focus and unable to concentrate and unable to, function in her role and in her craft. And so nightmares, intrusive thoughts, all of those kinds of symptoms. And they kind of all blur together because there'll also be episodes of depression. And usually coming out of these traumatic events, it's not just anxiety, but there could be depressive episodes as well.
Which leads to mental illness.
Absolutely. Yeah. So mental illness is sometimes a chemical issue that's going on in the brain that someone might inherit. But if someone is experiencing lots of situational depression then can lead to chemical changes in the brain which weren't present before. So it can kind of go both ways. And unfortunately, many people self-medicate these symptoms through drugs or alcohol. Yeah. And so I come from the perspective that usually an addiction issue is not an addiction issue on its own. There's some kind of an underlying mental health issue. Otherwise, if someone was functioning really well, why would their life ever turn to a life of addiction? But for folks who are experiencing severe symptoms and they aren't being treated, or they're not being treated effectively, drugs and alcohol appears to those folks to sometimes offer a short-term solution, which then just creates a cycle of even more serious issues. And so this is what happened, in Marilyn's case. They were not effective mood stabilizing medications or antidepressant drugs at the time. So many of the doctors at that time prescribed sedatives, and the sedatives were usually barbiturates, which were highly addictive. And the studios at the time managed their talent by giving them amphetamine types of drugs when they needed energy, and then that would keep them keyed up, and then if they eventually needed to come to sleep, go to sleep so they could get to work early in the morning again, so they would give them sedatives, and that starts up a whole other cycle. The entertainment industry does draw a lot of people who are highly creative, who might even have bipolar disorder, or the entertainment industry sometimes draws lots of folks who have personality disorders. There's a connection sometimes between those industries and pre-existing conditions that people are dealing with.
And want to say something, right? Because that, I'm not sure exactly what's happening with my volume here. For those of you that are witnessing it, I certainly apologize for it. But I think that one of the things that we're also hearing is creative people also are very bright. And I think that it doesn't always have to be that you're a creative person, you have a mental, kind of health disorder. That's not what we're saying here, but it does lend itself a lot of times if you're highly creative. And for somebody that may be watching this right now, what are, Marilyn acted out in terms of that she had these situational, depressions where she would shut down, she would disassociate. Did she ever continue? I know we talked a little bit, you touched on it with Joe DiMaggio, but luckily she didn't stay, because there's a lot of people that stay in those abusive relationships. So she didn't. So she had enough kind of awareness to go, you know what, I'm not going to stay here. But where else did it act out on a physical level where she might have been abused? And or did she end the cycle after childhood in terms of the physical abuse?
Well, there was an early relationship with Fred Carger. Her relationship between her divorce from her first husband, James Dougherty, and then her relationship maybe with her agent, Johnny Hyde. There was a significant relationship with Carger, who was emotionally abusive to her, put her down, wouldn't marry her, desired her, but found fault in the things that she did. And that appeared to be a very unhealthy relationship. In fact, Marilyn remained connected to Fred Carger's sister and mother, who fell in love with her, and they really feared at the time of that relationship that Fred would wind up hurting her, which he did. And I think after he rejected her, he tried to win Marilyn back, and Marilyn established some boundaries in that relationship as well. So she was able to extricate herself from unhealthy relationships. I think with Arthur Miller, he had a hard time just coping with the seriousness of Marilyn's issues. And that's another piece of this puzzle, is that when folks are dealing with the impact of trauma or depressive or bipolar illnesses, the family, the partner sometimes feels really powerless, and we don't know how to respond. We sometimes feel incompetent, and that's really a horrible thing to feel. And so sometimes there could be kind of an emotional distancing. He just didn't know what to do, and he felt that she was kind of self-destructing and he could no longer be a part of it. And the treatment that they were involved in at the time didn't improve things. He did get involved in his own therapy, though, Arthur Miller did, and so did Joe DiMaggio. Joe made some progress in his own treatment, and that's why Marilyn invited him back into her life later on, before her death. He had really worked on many of those issues.
You bring up, and this point is that you said that, sometimes loved ones don't know how to deal with it. And I think what happens is, if I have a broken arm, everybody sees it. It's much more visible, it's tangible. But when we start talking about mental health issues, they're intangible. And so if you don't know how to deal with it, a lot of times you think the person's doing it on purpose, and they may not be doing it on purpose at all. And then what happens, the person that is being directed, and maybe that person's getting mad at them, they start to shut down and they start to feel shame. So guess what doesn't happen is the person doesn't get help, or the proper help. And I think this is an important point for us to bring up, that you may be a parent, you may have a loved one that you are getting mad at, you're getting angry. Why aren't they acting like my other children? Why do I have so much challenges with this child, etc.? Is that you might not be getting the right help. And I've heard this happen in my own, coaching practice, where we brought them to this therapist and that therapist. Well, guess what? It may not be the right therapist. It may not be the right, especially if they have chemical issues happening in the brain, right? Acting out in inappropriate ways. Don't just take them to a therapist. With now the research coming out with the brain, brain mapping and looking at the brain and finding out what are some of these solutions. I think this is a really important point, Gary, to talk
And it's
about.
good to get second opinions too. We have to be our own healthcare advocates. And I mean, gone are the days, I think, when the doctors are the almighty and whatever they say that we just accept and go with. I mean, we have to advocate for our care. It's okay to ask questions. It's okay to get second opinions. This is very important. And a lot of these symptoms, as families or individuals deal with them, it just doesn't suddenly pop up on our radar. Oh, I'm dealing with a mental health issue. I'm dealing with irritability and crankiness and low energy and someone being emotionally distant in a relationship, and that's not the way it was before. So oftentimes all of these are signs and symptoms of some kind of an undiagnosed mental illness. There's some really good research and books available. Terrence Real is an author who wrote a book called I Can't Get Through to You and I Don't Want to Talk About It. And it's a real good book for partners to talk about, whether they're same gender or opposite gender, because oftentimes, there's a depression going on. And I think culturally, women are more in touch with sadness and depression, but it's harder for guys. Guys tend to get angry and irritable, and sometimes that is not caught or identified as an underlying depressive illness. And so those two books that I talk about are almost like the male and female versions to read when you feel like you can't get through to your partner, or the partner is shutting down and doesn't want to talk about it.
Repeat that book.
Terrence Real, I Can't Get Through to You, and I Don't Want to Talk About It.
Wow.
And there's other really good research in relationships. John Gottman is really the guru on couples therapy, and he's identified what he calls the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse that leads to the ending of a relationship, and this is all research based, and all of these interventions are tried and true. And so anyone who's struggling with a marital issue, I really encourage them to read the Gottman book, Why Marriages Succeed or Fail. And Gottman comes up with new books every few years, and they're all really valuable and research based. But sometimes that's just a really good way in for couples, because a lot of these issues that we're talking about begin to surface within the context of a relationship.
So how about if somebody is experiencing a child, and what are some of the symptoms that we should be looking for?
Well, with children, there's a wide range of behavioral markers. I would say anything that your gut tells you doesn't seem right, respond to. Or if you're getting feedback from the school or from other environments about your child, listen to that. Sometimes I think we're a little bit defensive about our children, and we think, we know our children well. And I'm sure there's people out there that are well-intended or not well-intended, but these are all little bits and pieces. And so it's important that we can filter things out and pick out maybe not what we want to hear, but little hints and clues that we should just look at and explore and consider before we dismiss it. And so, a pediatrician is a really good place to start with a child, getting developmental screenings for children when they are still young, and building a really good relationship with your child's school guidance department. and making sure that your children are developmentally progressing. Anything that sparks a concern on the school level is a time to get involved at the school and get more information.
So one of the things I want to bring up also, Gary, is that sometimes a parent may not see the signs, because what happens is that, let's say they went through a trauma like a divorce. So the parent's going through the divorce, the child starts to change, there's behavior changes, their grades start to go down, whatever it is. Oh, they're a teenager. And I think one of the things we have to do as parents is be very acutely aware of the things that we tell ourselves, because if we were to face that something might be wrong, our lives are so busy and packed now. Oh my God, that's a big trauma to have to deal with. So we brush it off to the fact that they're a teenager, or oh, they're acting this way because my husband and I just went through a divorce. What do you say to that?
Well, no, all of these signs are really important. If there's a previous level of functioning and there's a significant change, if there's isolating behavior, grades that are dropping, the mood seems different, it's worth exploring. It's worth getting an assessment, seeking a professional to do the assessment on the child and give you accurate information. So everything's worth exploration, and a professional will help you determine if it's something to be concerned about and needs to be treated, or maybe just monitored and watched, or maybe there's a simple explanation. Maybe it really is just a child moving into a different developmental level, and this is developmentally appropriate for this child. All kids are different, and so what one of our children might have been like reaching adolescence, the other one might be totally different. Kids have different temperaments. Sometimes we consider kids like orchids or dandelions. The dandelions are the kids that, they just seem to just weather it all. They're like a dandelion that could grow within a crack on a sidewalk, whether the ground is fertile or dry or wet. They just flourish and they do well. Very resilient. Others are orchids, and with orchids, they're a little bit more high maintenance. They need a certain amount of light. They need a certain amount of moisture in the water. They're just a little bit more delicate, and that's just a dispositional difference, and that could be confusing too for parents. But we can always seek an assessment from a professional that'll kind of give us something a little bit more definitive. Put our mind.
And I just want to add something real quick on this too, because it's a really important point that you're bringing up, is to get help, get the assessment. If your gut says you don't like the therapist, or there's something off with the therapist, get a second opinion. That's number one. And number two is that, if you find yourself getting mad at your child and yelling at your child, that's the time to take a step back and go, I'm getting angry, but I'm not getting curious. And I think as parents, as partners, the key is to ask questions, not to get mad, because when you get mad, the other person's going to shut down. Don't you agree, Gary?
Absolutely. And I think we should really underscore, though, certain kind of red flags. So, if somebody is talking about, someone in your life, a child or an adult, is talking about not really wanting to be here anymore, wishing that they were gone, talking about suicide. Some people believe that if someone talks about it, that doesn't mean that they're going to do it. But if you start to hear someone talking about not being around anymore and wanting to do something to end their life, that's something that's really serious. Or if someone is starting to show some self-injurious behavior, like cutting and some kind of mutilation, that's something to take action on pretty quickly as well. That's not something to kind of push to a back burner.
Yeah. So going forward, I know with Marilyn, circling back with her, in the Fragments book, she was a deep thinker, and some of her most darkest thoughts kind of came through that. I know you wanted to read something around Marilyn and fragments before we kind of move on and give people some actual numbers that they can call if they're really, having either suicidal thoughts, they're dealing with sexual or physical abuse, or you have a loved one that you just need to get some help on. So, let's look at the impact of, when somebody is having some of these horrific thoughts, and Marilyn certainly was communicating through her words at the time. Some of the biographers that even talked about her life, they weren't necessarily, they were glossing over it. And one of the things we want to do in this series is not gloss over the seriousness of suicide. We're on a all-time high right now, guys, both in the teen level and midlife level. So it's important for us to hear that call for help.
If you read Marilyn's journals, which have been published in fragments and other books, lots of emphasis on negative thoughts and on suicidality. I mean, she wrote very clearly about her thoughts of suicide over the years. And there's a quote that I think really captures what was going on in her life as a child, and with the physical abuse and sexual abuse that was going on, which leads to us being able to explore some issues related to molestation and rape of children, which is what she wrote about here. I will not be punished or be whipped or be threatened or not be loved or sent to hell to burn with bad people, feeling that I am also bad, or to be afraid of my genitals, being or ashamed, exposed, known and seen. So what? Or ashamed of my sensitive feelings. They are reality, or colors, or screaming, or doing nothing. And I do have feelings that were very strongly sexual feelings ever since I was a small child. You can hear, you can even see the jumble of her writing this. These are all fragments, and she seems overwhelmed by all of these feelings, and she's talking about being sexualized early as a child. And so, this is one of the issues that her biographers, I think, have really led to some misperceptions about sexual abuse, that somehow if Marilyn as a child was molested, that might have been, less severe if she had been forcibly raped. And these are messages that we don't want the public to hear. All forms of sexual abuse are damaging to children, whether it's a molestation or a touch, or whether it's something more forceful. And I think what's important for the public to understand is that when a child is raped, where there's physical injury and pain involved, what that does is it sends a little bit of a clearer message about who was the victim and who was the offender. And that could lead to some appropriate responsibility. But in the cases of molestation, a molestation might not be painful. There might be no marks or no injuries resulting from it. So there's no clear implication for the child that there was an offender. And the body is designed to react when it's touched. So in molestation, the body might experience some pleasurable sensations, and that becomes very confusing to the child, and they might perceive themselves as an equal participant or even responsible for what happened. And so that can complicate things later on, leading to shame and guilt and sense of responsibility. So we don't want to minimize any form of sexual abuse of children. It is all damaging, and the responsibility is always of the older person or the adult who has the power. And there's lots of different forms of power. It's not just physical power, but it's sometimes age or size or authority or role. And so I just felt it was really important to underscore that and do justice to Marilyn, who I think was so mistreated by previous male biographers who either denied or minimized the impact of the trauma that she experienced. And we don't know the whole extent of it, whether it was forcible with injury or not, and it doesn't really matter. It doesn't really matter. And I just felt that was important to say.
Well, I think it's an important point, and it's one that certainly up until now hasn't really been dealt with in any of the biographies of Marilyn. And I think with all the change happening, with things coming that were people of power, with the being exposed now, with the imbalance, especially in Hollywood, with a lot of people taking advantage of young stars and maybe not even so much young stars, but certainly in terms of that power imbalance. So Gary, in closing, unless there's something else you want to talk about, Marilyn, is where can people get help? Because I think that's the key here.
Well, starting with if you feel that a child is being abused or neglected in some way, you don't have to know this for fact. It's your suspicion that could generate an investigation that can help and save that child. The child helpline is here, 1-800 for a child, which is 1-800-442-4453. Each individual state has its own child and elder abuse hotline that you can call as well, but this is a national line.
Let's put that up there one more time. It's 422, right? It's a 1-800-422-4453. So if you have any suspicion of a child being neglected, abused, whatever you may be feeling, reach out, get help. And you can go ahead and put that down now, Gary. And just the one thing I'd like to say is that we broke this up into 3 parts this week because there's so much information around this topic. It's a loaded topic, it's a sensitive topic, and it's one that needs to we need to have better conversations. Even if we take the life of Marilyn Monroe and we utilize her life as an example, let's stop glossing over it and let's start really getting the help, whether it's yourself or somebody you love. It is time. And for next week, we're going to move into bipolar disorder as well as borderline personality. These 2 areas of mental illness can get very convoluted. There's a lot of shame and stigma still around it, but we're starting to have more conversations. So Gary, what would you like to leave people with this week as well?
I'd like to leave folks with a national hotline that they could call. It's the Suicide Prevention Hotline. But if someone is struggling with any issue, depression, anxiety, and needs to reach out to speak to someone, there are resources available, and these resources can link you to local resources. So here is the number of 1-800-273-TALK. And for those of you who are struggling and have healthcare insurance, your healthcare membership line should be able to link you with services. And your local mental health center sometimes has access to state funds if you are uninsured. There's other opportunities to receive funding for services on a sliding fee scale, possibly as well. So always reach out to your local mental health center or your insurance membership line to access services that you are entitled to.
I think it's important for all of us to stop in our busy lives, have a self-reflection, listen, and pay attention and get curious. Get curious. And when we're curious, then we can discover. When we think we know it all or we discount it, that's when we end up creating sometimes more problems than we're trying to solve. So know that there's a lot of help out there. If you have any comments or questions this week, please email Gary Vataco, Robles, or myself. Just private message us. We'll hopefully be able to read or answer your questions next week when we delve a little deeper into mental illness and addiction. And Gary, I'll let you tell us Marilyn's wonderful holding a thought quote so I don't mess it up this week. So you can say it.
Well, Marilyn, when she needed the support of other people, she would ask them, please hold a good thought for me. And so we are holding a good thought for Marilyn and other people who struggle with the issues that she struggled with.
Bye for now.